And it's lovely to see you. We are continuing in our series, Workmen of the Word. And we're again tonight in the book of Ezra. We hope to finish Ezra tonight and get into Nehemiah next week. So we're setting the stage for Nehemiah to come forth in the scriptures. I want to read first that psalm again, just to remind our hearts. Psalm 137. Psalm 137. We'll read it first, and then we'll go to where we left off last week in Ezra. Psalm 137, verse 1. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. And over now, please, to the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra. Switch it on. All right, right. That would be a good idea, wouldn't it? That's it. Lovely, thank you. So we're now going to read just where we left off last week. And what the plan tonight is to try to finish Ezra, give you an outline of Ezra, so we can come into Nehemiah. Now, you will remember that there were 3 expeditions back from Babylon to the land, to Jerusalem. We looked at one of them last week. We're going to just slightly finish that off. Then we're going to look at the second one, which was under Ezra. And then next week we'll take up the expedition back to the land by Nehemiah. Now, we're in chapter 3. And we'll have a drop your eye down, please, to verse 10. Verse 10. We did a little bit of this, but I want to finish off a few thoughts. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord, after the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang together by course in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good. For his mercy endureth forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men, that had seen the first house when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. I suppose if you want a little outline for these chapters, you could use this. Chapter 3, the work commences. So chapter 3, the work commences. Chapter 4, the work ceases. We're going to look at that. Why did the work cease? Chapter 5, the work continues. And chapter 6, the work is completed. Now, there's always work to do for the Lord. There's never a time when there's no work to do for the Lord. And these were men who were workmen of the word, who worked for the Lord. Now, Nehemiah, his name means helper. Help. And I suppose really that's all any of us would ever want to be remembered for, isn't it? That when it comes our time to go home, wouldn't it be nice to be remembered that we were a help to the people of God? There's something wrong with a believer that doesn't want to help in the assembly. Now, Ezra was a man who helped the people of God. He had a great impact on his generation. What a legacy Ezra left behind. Now you'll notice that the people gathered themselves together as one man. We looked at it last week. We saw the variety of the people. Everybody's needed. We saw the importance of the unity of the people. They gathered together as one man. All the people, it says in verse 8, did you read it? All the people, it says, shouted forth. And then it says in verse 11, and they sang together, and all the people shouted. There's a great emphasis here on the word all. All of them came together. It's no accident that Paul uses the word all very much in Philippians. He says to the Philippians, I long after you all in the bowels of Jesus Christ. You see, the reason why he did that, why Paul used the word all so much, was because there were two sisters at Philippi and they weren't agreeing. Now, it could easily have been two brothers, but it's two sisters and they're not agreeing with each other. And so Paul, as he writes the epistle to the Philippians about this word all, he says there's no restrictions or limitations of my love for you. He says, because I long after you all. And then he says to them, stand fast in one spirit. Stand fast in one mind. And then he says this, be like-minded of one accord. I suppose you could say about Ezra here what Paul said about the Philippians, that they were laborers together with God. And Ezra was a laborer together with God. So it's very important that you have unity when you build. You must have unity. It's very important not only that you have unity, that you have harmony. It's a great thing to have variety. And it's a wonderful thing to have men of ability. Now, I want to draw some very practical lessons tonight from this passage. I want you to read verse 10 with me, if you would. This is the first practical lesson. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel. Now, did you notice that, please? Would you note that for me? They set the priests in their apparel. Now, I'll leave this for your consideration. I'm not going to apply this. I'm just leaving it for your consideration. But it shocked me this week. It shocked me when I looked it up. In Exodus 29, it tells you what the priest's apparel was. It was linen. The priests had a linen coat, and the priests wore a linen vest, linen breeches. But what is the root word for apparel here? What is the root word in the Old Testament for linen? You'll never guess. What is the Spirit of God teaching us here? What is the root word for linen in the Old Testament? Do you know what the root meaning is? Divided fibers. You see? Divided fibers? Let me give you a second rendering. Separated fibers. The priests wore clothing that showed they were separated from the world outside. The word linen in the Old Testament is translated divided fibers, separated fibers. Now, I'm not going to apply that. But there has to be a standard of dress among the people of God. And here you'll see that there was a dress standard among the priests that was appropriate to the people of God, to the character of God, and to the testimony of God. I'm not going to apply it. Divided fibers, separated fibers. Now, have we looked not only at the clothing of the priests, have we looked at the conducting of the praise? Verse 11. The clothing of the priests, verse 10, the conducting of the praise, verse 11, and they sang together in course, praising and giving thanks unto God. They sang together. They gave thanks unto the Lord together. All of them came together. There was no separation of young people and old people. That's a very important thing nowadays. No separation of young people and old people. They all came together as one body, and they sang unto the Lord. Again, I'm not going to apply that. I'm just going to leave it with you for your consideration. All of them came together. And then in verse 12, you'll see the contribution of the people. But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers who were ancient men, have we any ancient men here, that had first seen the first house when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy. Ancient men. Well, suppose there are some ancient men. These were men who saw the first house, the first temple. And it says that some of them wept for joy. See the end of verse 12, and many shouted. Now, I used to think that it was the old people that wept for joy and the young people that shouted. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It says they all came together to shout for joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. Can I tell you this just on the way through? If you're listening on the recording, we need the caution and we need the experience of older men just as much as we need the enthusiasm of younger people. And what I'm preaching here tonight is this. There was a lovely blended ministry, and we need both. Don't discard the white heads. Don't discard the white heads as being out of touch, because it's the white heads who have experienced God. So we need the white heads. But we also need the young people. We need the enthusiasm, and we need the youth coming forth. Remember this, but it's the white heads that Timothy speaks of that approved God. Men approved of God. And so you have this lovely blend here between the young people and the old people, the ancient men, and they're shouting praise for what the Lord has done. Have a wee quick look at chapter 4 now. If you look down chapter 4, you'll see, we'll read verse 1. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple, now it wasn't long before you have the adversaries. So you can put verse 1, the adversaries. They're going to try and stop the work. If the devil could stop the work in Woodford tonight, he would have it stopped. But these adversaries are seen here in verse 1. Now, when do you hear the amalgamation in verse 2? Then they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers and said unto them, Let us build with you, for we seek your God as ye do, and we do sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon king of Assur, which brought us up. Here's the amalgamation. The adversaries, they tried to stop the work. It didn't work. So what do the adversaries do when they try to stop the work and that doesn't work? Instead of trying to stop the work, they try to infiltrate the work. So here they are, and you know what they're saying? Come on, and we'll all build a temple together. This is the first seeds of the ecumenical movement. Come on with the world. Come on with the world. We'll bring you into the assembly, and we'll all get together, and we'll build together. Now, this is a proposal of amalgamation. Can I say this? I love verse 3. What do you hear the answer? The adversaries, the amalgamation, what do you hear the answers? I think this man originally came from East Belfast, because this is a wonderful answer. But Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the chief of the fathers of Israel said unto them, You have nothing to do with us. Wasn't that you have nothing to do? That sounds like an East Belfast man. You have nothing to do with us to build an house unto our God. Now, you see, today, they would call you sort of a bigot if you said that. They'd say, that's Boyd, he's a bit rude, he's a bit narrow-minded. But this man took a stand, and he just point blank said no. You know what I'm going to tell you? We need men that are able to say no. Men that will take a faithful stand. And Zerubbabel turns to him And he says no. You know what amalgamation brings? Amalgamation brings weakness. It brings weakness. And then verse 4, you'll see their plan exposed. What do you see their plan exposed? The adversaries in 1, they tried the amalgamation in verse 2. You see the answer in verse 3. What do you see the plan exposed? Then the people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building. That's their whole plan exposed. They're trying to weaken the hands. This book speaks about God strengthening the hands. And here you have the people of the land trying to weaken the hands of the people of Judah. Now, not only that, read verse 5. And they hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose. Let me say this to you. This is the cunning of the foes. The cunning of the foes that are against us. The devil's out to try to weaken the testimony here in Woodford. He will do absolutely anything to weaken the testimony here in Woodford Assembly. And the one thing we must never do is have any alliance with the world. We cannot bring the world into the assembly, because all it will do is weaken the testimony. And also, can I say this to you very tenderly? There is today a trend of watering down the gospel. There is a trend to water down the gospel. We must preach repentance toward God and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Can I say this if you're taking note? Shallow preaching produces shallow converts. Shallow preaching produces shallow converts. Now see verse 5 there. They brought these counselors in. These boys come in, and you know what the root of this word is? They troubled the people of God, and they terrified them. They absolutely terrified them from building the house of the Lord. There was aggression. Now, where did the aggression stem from? It stemmed from this. The Bible tells us that the devil is a roaring lion. And they were roaring at the people to stop them building the house of God. This was slander, and it was satanic wickedness in its worst form. And it still happens today. There is still satanic slander. There is still terrible wickedness and aggression against the people of God. And they stop the work. Now, let me show you how effective they were. You see from verse 5, if you're taking notes, from verse 5 of chapter 4, this chapter stops at verse 6. And from verse 6 to verse 24, there is a parenthesis of 4 letters. 4 letters that we don't have time to deal with. But this, from 6 to 24, is a parenthesis of 4 letters. But you'll grasp this when I read verse 24. So verse 5 is actually followed chronologically by verse 24. Now watch this. We'll read verse 5 again. They hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose. Now read verse 24. Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. So it ceased unto the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. They distorted the truth of God. Have a look at verse 12. They told lies about them. Be it known unto the king that the Jews which came up with thee to us are come up to Jerusalem. Now, when you hear the lies they told, building the rebellious and the bad city, and have set up the walls thereof and joined the foundation. That was lies. The walls hadn't been built yet. We'll see that. This was a distortion of the truth. But let me show you what's worse. Verse 15. Then they went, the adversaries, that search might be made in the book of the records of thy fathers. So shalt thou find in the book of the records, and know that this city is a rebellious city, and hurtful on the kings and provinces, and that they have moved sedition within the same, of old time, for which cause was the city destroyed. What does that teach us? They looked up the books, the history books, and they discovered that there were men of the people of God who were rebellious. There were men of the people of God who did sin. Now, they used that as an excuse to stop the work of God. Now, here's a very practical point. This can happen even today. Men in a local area associated with the assembly, we need to be careful of the testimony, because I'll tell you why. If a brother falls into sin, it affects the whole assembly. And do you know all it does when a brother falls into sin? It just sets up a target for the devil to target the whole assembly and to bring down the whole testimony. And the devil here, you can see the devil's tools. I'll call them out to you. Falsehood. They used falsehood. They used exaggeration. They used flattery. They used false predictions against the people of God. And in verse 21, the king falls for it. And he says, give ye now commandment to cause these men to cease. Give ye now commandment to cause these men to cease. He made them stop. Made them stop. I want to read this verse 23. See, here's the adversaries. Their names are here. Now, when the copy of the king Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai, the scribe, and their companions, what do you hear this? They went in haste to Jerusalem unto the Jews and made them cease by force and by power. They used violence to stop the work of God. And the work of the Lord ceased. How long did it cease for? They managed to close it down for 15 years. The work of the Lord ceased. Sometimes, can I say this very gently? Sometimes in an assembly, the work of the Lord has ceased, but the people don't know it. That's a big thing to say. Sometimes in assemblies, things just keep rolling on and rolling on and rolling on, and the work of the Lord has ceased, but the people don't really realize it. But here, the work of the Lord was clearly stopped. It stopped for 15 years. How careful we need to be to guard the testimony of the work of the Lord. False accusations, adversaries, the work ceases. But I have good news. See in chapter 5, you could write this over chapter 5. The opposition is overcome. The opposition is overcome. There's a great lesson here, but there's a great lesson in chapter 5, verse 1. Then the prophets Haggai and the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, even unto them. Then rose up Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Joshua, and began to build the house of God which is at Jerusalem. Now here's what I want you to grasp on the way through. God raised two men up to overcome the work. He raised up Haggai and he raised up Zechariah. Now here's the lesson that I picked up this week it stunned me. See if you turn to Haggai, which we'll not do, we don't have the time. See if you turn to Haggai. He doesn't mention the opposition to the building of the temple. He doesn't mention it. There was massive opposition to the building. He doesn't mention it in his prophecy. Haggai doesn't mention the opposition. Why? Only thing he mentions is the condition of the people. You know why? You'll always have opposition. You will always have opposition when you're building for God. Always have opposition. But see all the opposition. Opposition can be overcome by the power of God. Overcome. Opposition can be overcome. Haggai tells us the real reason why the work stopped wasn't the opposition. Do you know the real reason why the work stopped? Do you know the real reason? The people of God no longer had a chief interest in the work of the Lord. The people of God had lost their chief interest in the work of the Lord. Wasn't the opposite? You're always going to have opposition. It's easily not easily, but it can be overcome by the power of God. But the biggest problem here was not the opposition. Because when the people of God lose interest, there comes in a dearth and a weakness in the assembly. And that's what happened here. And for 15 years, the work stopped. Now it begins again. And I kind of like this. If you're taking notes, Haggai speaks of the house of God. Zechariah speaks of the God of the house. You got that? Two of them together. Haggai speaks of the house of God. Zechariah speaks of the God of the house. Now what does that teach us? What does that teach us? It teaches us this. The complementary greatness of a blending of ministry. We need everybody to build. We need everybody. This assembly is all encompassing. We need everybody. And there needs to be a blending of the ministry. It is a great thing to have a variety of gifts within the assembly. And if the assembly lacks any gifts, it's quite within the remit of the elders to bring such resources in to do the teaching as needs to be done. So here we have verse 5. I want you to see the encouragement of the elders. This is the encouragement of the elders. I'm here to encourage you. I'm here to encourage everyone. And I want to encourage the elders. Look at verse 5. I think this is wonderful. In the midst of all that was going on, it says, but the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, that they could not cause them to cease till the matter came to Darius. The eye of their God was upon the elders. Can I tell you this? Dear brother, God will minister courage to you as you need it. God will minister courage to you as you need it. You know what this teaches me? There is no power on earth can contend with the power of God. And God's eye is upon you, brother. And every need you have, He can supply. And He gives courage just as we need it. Let's take a wee quick look at chapter 7. See if we can learn something from chapter 7. There's now a break in the book of 57 years. Now, we have just finished the temple being built. The temple was finished. Now Ezra comes on the scene. Now you say, how does Ezra come on the scene in chapter 7 when we've read all these chapters that he's wrote? Ezra wrote those chapters because they are history. Now Ezra comes on the scene himself. He comes to the world stage in chapter 7. We hear what it says. And I'm going to get caught with all these names here. I tried to avoid them last week, but we're going to get hit with them tonight. Now after these things in the reign of Artaxerxes, can I just say to you in the way through, in the reign of Artaxerxes, that tells us this. You know that Artaxerxes married Esther, don't you? Artaxerxes married Esther. Esther was queen for 20 years before Ezra left for Babylon. So you have here a link in time. Artaxerxes, he had married Esther. 20 years after he married Esther, Ezra left Babylon. So Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra the son of Sariah, the son of Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, the son of Shallum, the son of Zadok, the son of Ahitub, the son of Amariah, the son of Azariah. We'll go right through, and then it says in verse 6, this Ezra went up from Babylon. He was a ready scribe in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. Here's Ezra, and he comes to the world stage. How many people are with him this time? Last week we saw, if you're taking notes, we saw that when the people left Egypt, there was 603,000. Last week we saw when the first people, Zerubbabel, came back to Jerusalem, there was 50,000. How many is with Ezra? How many is with Ezra? In total there's 6,000 or 7,000. So the work is diminishing and the numbers are getting fewer. There's about 6,000 or 7,000 that leave the streams of Babylon to go back to the rubble of Jerusalem. Not everyone went back. Now I heard someone say last week, quite rightly so, it wasn't a sin to stay in Babylon. No, it wasn't a sin. And there are some people who could work for the Lord, I'm sure, in Babylon. There were. But there's a whole lot of people who were comfortable in Babylon. Quite comfortable with the world. And some settled in Babylon. Now let me ask you a very practical question. Where did the Jews learn about commerce? Where did the Jews learn about banking? Where did the Jewish people learn about money? Where did the Jewish people pick up about business? They didn't learn it in the temples of their God. You know where they learned it? They learned it down in Babylon. They didn't learn it in the house of God. They picked up and to this very day, the Jewish people control the monetary systems of the world. They do. Where did they learn it? They learned it down here in Babylon. Now, many were taken up with the commercialization and the comfort of Babylon. I don't need to apply that. There are so many Christians now who are taken up with commercialization and comfort. They have no time to work for the Lord. Some wept in Psalm 137. Some wept. Some wept. For some, the grandeur and the gold and the glory of Babylon was nothing to compare or satisfy with building the temple and the house of God. And in Psalm 137, they were brokenhearted. Some were brokenhearted. Now, you know a thing I learned here from this? The temple we saw had already been built. So Ezra wasn't called to build the temple. There's a big lesson in that. The temple had already been established. Ezra wasn't called to build the temple. He was called to beautify the house of God. You know, in a way, you and I are not called to plant assemblies. Most of us aren't called to establish or plant assemblies. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It would be great if you could. But most of ordinary people are not called to plant or establish assemblies. But we are called to beautify and add to the assembly of which God has called us to. Tell me this. What do you add to the work and the witness and the worship here in Woodford? What do you add to it? Are you building it up? We're not asked to plant assemblies. In fact, a great verse that I think all of us should keep in mind in this day and age is this. Thou madest me the keeper of the vineyard, but mine own vineyard have I not kept. That our hearts aren't divided. That our hearts should be purposed here for the worship and the work and the witness of building up Woodford Assembly. Now let's look a wee minute just at chapter 8 that we'll see, and then I'll finish. Chapter 8. These are now the chief of the fathers, and this is the genealogy of them that went up with me from Babylon in the reign of Artaxerxes. There was tears and sorrow here. Tears and sorrow because they were leaving their family behind. They were going on a dangerous journey. But did you notice this again? I want to encourage you tonight. Did you notice this again? That God again lists the names of the people who responded to his word. Do you know why God lists the names of the people who went with Nehemiah up to Jerusalem? Because it matters to God about you. God not only knew their names, but God numbered them. Every one of them mattered to the Lord. See everybody that's here tonight in this meeting. See everybody that took the trouble to leave their home and come out to the meeting. Every one of you matters to the Lord. Not only does he know your name, but he'll have this very meeting numbered. Now I want you to look with me at verse 15. I kind of like this. It's a lovely thought. Verse 15. And I gathered them together to the river that runneth to Ahava, and there abode we in tents 3 days, and I viewed the people and the priests, and found there are none of the sons of Levi. They got to the river. Now, I want that, if you're writing notes, write this down, and you can do this at home. Have a look at all the places that great prayer meetings were held at riversides. Have a look in the Bible at all the places where great prayer meetings were held at riversides. Sometime I'll do a series on it, the great prayer meetings at the riversides. Now, we're at the riverside here. It's a subject all of its own. But there's a big prayer meeting here that took place. Now, I want you to notice two things. Ezra took a stand. We saw that. He took a stand. Here's the second heading. Ezra took stock. Took stock. Watch verse 15. And I gathered them together at the river. And he just put his hand up and he says, boys, we're not going any further. We're not going any further. Stop. Stop. He stopped the whole thing. And it says, look at the second part of the verse, and I viewed the people. He took a moment to take stock. Tell us this. Tell me this. In your Christian life, how long has it been from you just took a minute to take stock? How you're going on. Your relationship with God. This man had the courage to stop them at the river. And he not only took a stand, but he took stock. He viewed the people. He paused them. And that verse came to me this afternoon as I knelt in the presence of the Lord. Be still and know that I am God. I think 2025 is going to be a great year for Woodford. I do. I think 2025 is going to be a great year for Woodford. I do. But I think God is calling you tonight to take a minute and take stock. Take stock of your walk with God. You see, when Jacob spent the night with the Lord at the river, the Lord at the river, the next day his whole life was changed. He took a stand and he took a stand and he took stock. He realized there was something missing. Did you notice this? He viewed the people in verse 15 and found there was none of the sons of Levi. That was critical to the work of the Lord. Wasn't it? Well, he stopped and took stock. There were no priests. How could you get the house of God to function if you had no priests? So he sent 11 men. There's the 11 men in verse 16. And he finds the priests in verse 17. But watch what he also found in verse 18. And by the good hand of our God upon us, they brought us a man of understanding. Stop there for a minute, can I? Brought us a man of understanding. I'm sure he shouted for joy. They didn't bring him a man of knowledge. Plenty of men of knowledge. They didn't bring him a man of wisdom. Plenty of men have wisdom. What did they bring him? A man of understanding. Why is that important? They needed a man. Did all these people going along? Wilmer reminded us in prayer last week. It actually hadn't dawned on me. Wilmer reminded us about thought of the logistics of the journey and the food that was required and all the things. I hadn't thought about that. But when you think of it, they needed a man of understanding. A man who understood the ways of God. A man who understood the ways of God. But also a man who understood the people. And they found it in this man. Isn't that the problem in Acts chapter 6 when the Grecian widows were complaining about being neglected? What were the qualifications for the men that they needed to distribute the goods to the Grecian widows? Men of understanding. Men of good reputation. Men who were honest. And they found a man here who was rich in his understanding. I'm not going to be able to finish what I thought I could finish tonight. Not going to be able to do it. Other than to say to you this. We'll finish with this. If I just take 5 minutes and then we can get to Nehemiah next week, because you'll be saying, when's this man ever going to get to Nehemiah? Just turn to chapter 10 and I'll leave you with a wee fourfold portrait of Ezra. All right? Fourfold portrait of Ezra. Now, let's see the first portrait of Ezra, verse 1. Now, when Ezra had prayed and when he had confessed, weeping and casting himself down. The first thing you'll notice is, please, Ezra getting down. Ezra getting down. All right? So he's getting down. Have a wee look, please, at verse 5. Then Ezra arose. So we've got him getting down. We'll have him rising. Verse 10. And Ezra the priest stood up. So we'll have him standing up. And then in verse 16, and the children of the captivity did so. And it says, by their names were separated and sat down. You got that? Ezra getting down. Ezra rising up. Ezra standing up. Ezra sitting down. Very quickly. Very quickly. If you look at chapter 9, verse 4, then were assembled unto every one that trembled at the words of God. Then were assembled unto every one that trembled at the words of God. Ezra gets down. And whatever he says, whatever way this man got down in the presence of God to confess the sin of the nation, the people trembled. The people trembled. He confessed the sin of the nation. His sorrow, they saw his own sorrow and it was effective upon them. And they trembled at the voice of a faithful man. Ezra gets down. Ezra rises up. Ezra stood up in verse 10. I better stop or I'll be getting into trouble. Verse 16, Ezra sat down. Why did he sit down? I'd love to preach on the rest of it. Don't. Why did he sit down? Very simply this. He sat down because his work was finished. His work was finished. So we have seen the two expeditions. We've seen the first one ending in chapter 6 by Zerubbabel. And we've seen the second expedition ending in chapter 11 by Ezra. But can I say this last thought? Great man though Ezra was, you know what he realized? He realized he was no good at walls and he was no good at gates. That's what he realized. You know what he realized? I can't do it all myself. That's why we don't believe in a one-man ministry. I can't do it all myself. And next week, God's going to bring forth a man who will build the walls, who will rehang the gates, who will fortify the city of Jerusalem. The testimony will continue. You know the biggest thing Ezra had to learn? Do you know the biggest thing Ezra had to learn to do that very few people can do? Had to learn to do this. Stand aside stand aside, because God was bringing a man to finish the work. We'll see it next week. A man, says Jeremiah, who will stand in the gap. And next week we'll start 2 weeks on this great man, Nehemiah. May the Lord bless you.